the month of November, we have decided to address ourselves to the sort of the esoteric background and aspects of our domicile, the city and the valley of Los Angeles. And as such, I need to perhaps give a little bit of a warning that these discourses may be liberally, and that is not in the political sense, I assure you, but liberally peppered with personal reminiscences and anecdotes. I hope that I can restrain myself from sharing too many of these, because I know that they could become tedious. But I also assure you that whenever a particular subject matter within our overall topic is a matter of personal experience to me, I will then proceed from that personal experience to as much, let's say, theoretical and philosophical exegesis, to use a very fancy word, of that subject. So we will not get bogged down in an aged person's personal memories, which is always pleasant to the aged person, but seldom as pleasant to those who are listening or observing the situation. So let me then start with what I warned you about, namely a personal experience for which, as you may guess, I don't really claim any particular credit, but which occurred on New Year's Day 1953, which was the first time that I came to and planted my feet, at that time only temporarily, on the soil of the City of the Angels. I had already been a resident of California and the USA for about half a year, and I managed to take a little trip, a visit to Los Angeles on that New Year's weekend, well, primarily in order to acquaint myself with the City of the Angels and all that it may stand for. And on that, I was traveling with a friend. We both were members of the Theosophical Society in the San Joaquin Valley, which I still consider the California Siberia. Not because of its temperature, but for other reasons. In any event, on a beautiful sunny New Year's Day, we drove up to the Griffith Observatory, and we stood there overlooking the crystal clear valley of Los Angeles. And while thus observing this rather remarkable sight, I went into a kind of reverie. I would say it's the sort of thing that we Jungians call an active imagination. You can call it whatever you want, but it was significant for me. And what this reverie consisted of, that the physical, the visible sight, the panorama, sort of disappeared into a mist, and out of the mist arose a somewhat different image, which was particularly clear looking over toward the ocean, which was actually quite clear because of the sunlight at that time, but which was quite different. There were towers, there were architecturally strange structures that certainly did not belong to contemporary Los Angeles, and there were sonorous distant bells, which also were not to be heard physically on that New Year's morning. And with it came the sort of the verbal explanation, as this sometimes happens, because our minds don't like to see things without attaching some kind of meaning to them, that this is the new Alexandria. And there was no doubt in my mind, after those few minutes of whatever we wish to call it, of reverie, that this was the place where I was to settle, possibly till the end of my earthly life, which is exactly what I did. Now, a little bit about a confirmation, as it might be called, of sorts regarding that, because a few years later I had an occasion to converse very casually at that time with Mr. Manley Palmer Hall, to whose organization and work I became then attached. And lo and behold, or rather not so much behold, but here Mr. Hall used the very same expression, speaking about the revival of the esoteric traditions and his work. He said, well, you know, we are here in the new Alexandria. And while my body was much stronger owing to my youthful age at the time, my knees began to shake, and I said, oh my word, you know. Now, of course, I was not uninformed about ancient Alexandria and what it stood for. I haven't read yet the famous, then very, very well-known Alexandria Quartet books by Lawrence Durrell, whom I have a great deal of liking for. But let's say, owing to my studies, of course, I was familiar with what Alexandria stood for, but it may be useful to mention that not only did I have some information about ancient Alexandria, but I also had, and I still do, a curious interest in and reverence for the great Alexander, the invincible Alexander, who founded that city and who, after having created by way of his incredible victorious conquests a living bridge of peoples between the Middle East and the Far East, joining India with Egypt and all the countries in between. Therefore his city, which I never visited personally, was of very great interest to me, especially in a historical context. Now, at a more profound level, it is what needs to be kept in mind is that for a period of about 500 years, what then initially was the new city in Egypt, the new city of Alexander, because it was built practically out of nothing, became not only a political and cultural center, but it became the great center of esoteric knowledge and wisdom, and let's say the outflow of that wisdom, the continuing movements of the ideas and realizations which originated in that period in Alexandria nourished a certain tradition which we often call the esoteric tradition throughout the history of our culture to the present time. So it was, in terms of its cultural, especially its spiritual cultural activities and influence, of immense importance for the Mediterranean and ultimately Western culture, from, I don't know, from Ireland to Australia, and from Iceland to New Zealand, and to the Tierra del Fuego, all over the world. Now, let me give you a little insight from someone else on that same subject. Read to you a paragraph from a lovely little book by the French poet and writer Jacques Lacarrière, who, since we just mentioned him before, was the last great personal friend and associate of Lawrence Durrell. Here's Jacques Lacarrière in his little book entitled The Gnostics, writes about Alexandria. Crucible, burning glass, mortar and blast furnace, the still wherein all heavens, all gods, all visions are mixed, distilled, infused and transfused. Such was Alexandria in the 2nd century. He starts with that particular historical period in his book. Look wherever you will, interrogate history from any standpoint or level whatever, and you will find all races represented there, except the Chinese who have not yet arrived, all continents, Africa, Asia, Europe, and all ages, ancient Egypt, whose sanctuaries are preserved there, the ages of Athens and Rome, of Judea, Palestine, and Babylon. All these elements are gathered together in this knot of the delta, the city which is to the river what lungs are to men and branches to a tree, the place through which they breathe and the source of their inspiration. A more impressive and poetic description I have never heard before. And so you may perhaps imagine that when whatever out of my own unconscious I came up with that appellation, and then found it confirmed by the great wise man of Los Angeles himself, it really made an impression and made me stick around here all these decades. Now then, we know, of course, that just as a tiny bit of historical background, that ancient Alexandria became the spiritual capital, certainly of the Mediterranean world, and owing to the extension of Alexander's conquest over a very large territory in addition to that, largely because the previously crucial spiritual, how should we put it, spiritual centers of the Mediterranean world had declined. These spiritual centers were and are remembered as the mysteries. And we certainly don't need to go into trying to enumerate even half of them, but they were institutions largely originating perhaps in two places, although different ones, in ancient Greece and in ancient Egypt, and they included the greatest, the most famous of all mysteries, the Eleusinian, and added to that the Dionysian, the Orphic, and then the Egyptian mysteries and so forth. Now these mysteries were, how should we put it? They were laboratories of the spirit. Unfortunately, in the Victorian era, in literature, they received the name the mystery schools, and that has always bothered me. First of all, because I never liked school. I ended up teaching it later on at a different level, but I never liked it. I always felt that in a country where children love to go to school, there is something wrong, first of all, with the school, and secondly, with the children. So I did not belong to them. But let's say these were not centers of instruction. They were not centers of intellectual discipline, but rather they were laboratories of the souls of people. People went there not to be informed, but to be transformed. They went there to undergo essential and abiding change in their inner nature. The testimonies to that effect are numerous, and I'll just mention one coming from someone who really is not particularly known as a mystic himself, namely the great statesman and orator Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero is credited with the saying that the greatest ennobling influence that has ever come to humanity was the existence of the Eleusinian mysteries. So let's say there was something important going on for a limited number of people, limited by their own choice, because anybody except someone who was convicted as a murderer was eligible to be initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. Men and women, freed slaves, and all kinds of people. So it was not a matter of any exclusion on some social basis was practiced, but rather an inclusion on the basis that all people have a soul, have a spirit that is in need of cultivation and transformation. But as I mentioned before, like all institutions, even of a spiritual nature, the mysteries declined. And by the time it came close to the Alexandrian period, especially the beginning of the Christian era, they were not as well attended and not as effective in their activities as they had been before. But somehow the intentionality that resided within the mysteries and in addition to the intentionality, also we might say that the disciplines, the ways and means whereby the interior being of the human may be stimulated and transformed, these continued. And they continued in a somewhat different external form, but they produced the same results. And they continued almost without exception in the city of the invincible Alexander on the coast of Egypt, called Alexandria. The three-leaved clover, as I like to call it, and I am sorry if thereby I'm bypassing the Irish symbolism at this movement, the shamrock. The three-leaved clover was Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and Hermeticism. Each one of these schools had its own set of teachers. Each one of these schools had its own nomenclature and its practices, but they were aspiring to the same thing, to the transformation of what we nowadays call the human psyche, to the transformation of the human character, to the, we might say, the recreation of the internal unity of the human being, that same unity that many, many centuries, indeed more than 2 millennia later, the Swiss Dr. Carl Jung referred to as individuation, whereby he meant becoming what in German we call an individuum, an indivisible unity, wherein the body is no longer disunited, torn away from the psyche is not torn away from the spirit, but where all of these principles work together for a greater and fuller, a more abundant life. Now then, with that grandiloquent introduction to Alexandria Old and New, we might now come a little bit to the new Alexandria. I was, of course, aware that in a city of this sort, which was introduced in such a lovely and dramatic way to me, as well perhaps to others, some interesting things were going on. And I was already connected formally with one of the interesting things because I became fascinated by that particular school of thought already in Austria and in my native Hungary, namely the Theosophical Society, which upon my arrival in the United States I joined formally. So I knew that I had some like-minded folk in Los Angeles who would be of interest to me and who would undoubtedly welcome me as well. But in addition to that, I knew that there were many, many varieties of esoteric thought and practice, and that literally by that time, by the 1950s, Los Angeles really could be called sort of the esoteric capital, at least of the United States, if not of a larger territory than that. And as I moved around in the city in the first months of my life here, well, immediately just from the modes of transportation, I could espy and to some extent investigate, just right off, as we say, as we say in Transylvania, just right off the bat, the following institutions. And I'll just rattle some of them off to you and then I'll say a little more about them and what they stood for later. On Western Avenue, sort of halfway down from Hollywood Boulevard to Wilshire, a gigantic barn of a building called the Agasha Temple, presided over by the very talented but by then somewhat aged medium, let's see, what was his name? Richard Zener, nice name. A little more about him later on. Down near the Los Angeles River, a cute little building entitled the Coptic Institute, presided over by an Egyptian gentleman named Hamid Bey. On 3rd Street, where I believe it's still there, now managed by various successors, down a very steep incline from the street, a cute little church building with all kinds of lights and colors, entitled the Super-at Light Church, which was founded by some lady whom I never met, but who responded to the no doubt very helpful name Mother Trust. I think the institution is still there if you go on 3rd Street, just a couple of blocks west of Alvarado. Up in the sort of the hilly area where subsequently Dodger Stadium was built, in a dark and foreboding huge garden amid big old trees stood a sinister-looking large building, which was, once you found out what it was known as the Los Angeles branch of the Great I Am. The Great I Am having been founded by a couple named Ballard, who moved here from Chicago and who attained to very great fame in the earlier part of the century, certainly in the 1930s and in the 1940s. The Ballards also had strong sympathies for someone whom they probably would not have had strong sympathies for if they had been in Europe and knew anything about him, namely Adolf Hitler. And consequently, they put forth a propaganda that was very displeasing to President Roosevelt, who did everything he could to put them out of business. But their tradition, if we can call it that, their teachings, survived, and later on in the 60s were picked up by an interesting lady who never met, I think, the Ballards, by the name of Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Elizabeth Clare Prophet and her multiple organizations were the direct successors of the I Am of the Ballards. Also, they then still, I may have even been on the construction, beautiful big building of the Founders Church of Religious Science in the Wilshire district, presided over by its founder, Ernest Holmes. And then, if you add them all up in the Los Angeles area, about 8 theosophical societies of this society alone, in addition to two independent theosophical societies, namely the United Lodge of Theosophists on 33rd and Grand, and the Theosophical Society headquartered in Altadena. So there was a lot of theosophistication going on in the Los Angeles area. And of course, not to go on and on and on, although I will come around to them, the two principal, how should we put it, centers of the Hindu wisdom, the Hindu tradition, namely the Vedanta Society of Southern California, which just around that time when I came here was constructing its beautiful little temple on what is called now Vedanta Place, what was really an extension of Ivor Avenue, right next to the freeway, who was not there at the time, which was not there at the time either, and presided over by the formidable Swami Prabhavananda, and attended by a number of prominent people, including Aldous Huxley, his close friend and associate Gerald Heard, and the third man of the trio, Christopher Isherwood, all on the last third being English expatriates who came out here during the war. And so I don't just go on enumerating all of this like some kind of an occult Los Angeles rosary, but let me say then, of course, what at least to me in so many ways topped them all and which became very, very precious to me, namely the Philosophical Research Society on the corner of Los Feliz and Griffith Park Boulevard, presided over by the tall and impressive and massive and in every ways astonishing Manley Palmer Hall. Now these were some that I observed, shall we say, very, very soon after my arrival in the city of the angels. Now let me then now jump from that little personal exercise of reminiscing into some intimations of the importance for spiritual matters of a city, whether it is Alexandria, whether it is Los Angeles, or some others. Well, wherever we look, the importance and the impact of the holy city is present. The archetypal figure of Western culture, Jesus, was born in Bethlehem, which is was a very, very small locale at the time, raised in Nazareth, an other village, but undergoes the great drama for which he is still revered and adored in Jerusalem, the sacred city of the Jews. In India, Benares, now called Varanasi, the most sacred city, which is considered the best place to die or to have one's remains disposed, for which reason I understand that the river is very heavily filled with human remains, but their presence therein makes no difference whatsoever to the pilgrims who joyously submerge themselves among the deteriorating corpses in the holy river. And I might say also, I don't think they are wearing masks. Just a little contemporary relevance, Rome, which is today, to this day, known as the Eternal City, or just as the Romans just referred to it, the city, Urbs. Up to this day, the successor of the high priest of ancient Rome, who, like the present high priest, bears among his titles Pontifex Maximus, meaning the supreme bridge builder, the Pope. To this day, on special occasion, gives the blessing to the Catholic world and others, which is always entitled the blessing Urbi et Orbi. And you know, in Europe we like puns. I have never gotten away from that noble predilection, meaning to the city and to the world. But the blessing first goes to the city, Urbi and then Orbi. The city is an archetype in the Jungian sense. The big city, the important city, which usually is sacred, always has a special. The Greeks had special names. Metropolis, for instance, which means, I think very few of us know that. We think it just means a great big bloody town. But it's not. Meter means mother. And so it's the mother city, is the metropolis. Similarly, the megalopolis, which means the very big city, mega being large. There is, we already referred to Alexandria, which by synchronistic circumstance for about 500 years became the undisputed spiritual center of the Mediterranean world. And now, of course, when we come to the United States, I don't want to bore you with too much history, so let me just outline sort of how this worked in terms of the spiritual interests, the often quite heterodox religious predilections of people in this country. They first came to the East Coast, and they settled in the Hudson Valley outside of New York. This began already before I never like to call it a revolution, the American War of Independence. Because it was not a revolution, it was a war of independence. It was not a social upheaval, but it was a separation from another country, Anyway, not to be too picky about that, but in the Hudson Valley, where by circumstance for about 30 years I found myself, for a brief period of time, usually a weekend or so, or half of a week, doing a program, and so I'm somewhat familiar with, at least with its spiritual atmosphere. If you were to catalog all the unusual, astonishing, amazing spiritual groups and associations of people, many of them coming from various other nations, Germans, Dutch, French, and many of them already, as time went on, of the population that increasingly could be called American, but all of a highly unusual and heterodox nature. It was the spawning field of American religion in the Hudson Valley of New York State. And as American history proceeded, as the country expanded from the East Coast further and further to the Midwest and ultimately to the West, of course, quite a few of these religious groups, to the extent that they survived, because they did have, and they still do have, a proclivity for schisms, for internal disruption and for things of that sort, but many of them certainly survived. And some of them became big religions, downright world religion, including the Mormons. Because even Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, started in the Hudson Valley as an itinerant magician, looking for and trying to deliver his services to people who were looking for buried treasure. What a nice metaphor, buried treasure in the earth and then buried treasure of God or religion subsequently. But as we well know, of course, Joseph Smith did not remain in the Hudson Valley. He, just like everyone else, and like sort of the whole spiritual currents, moved from there to the Midwest, being murdered in Carthage, Missouri, which I think Missouri is about as much Midwest as anything else, and his successors, of course, especially the redoubtable prophets coming out all the way to the Salt Lake Valley to Utah. So it's probably the outwardly historically most successful of the spiritual groups that started way back there is probably that of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, otherwise also known as the Mormons. But the same kind of curious movement, drift, was noticeable in the story of practically all the other unusual movements that came from the burnt-over district, as it was called, in New York State, and they all, to the extent that they survived, they all drifted westward. First to the Midwest, and by the 19th century, by the early 19th century, I should say, the spiritual center moved to a very large extent to the Chicago area. But it did not remain there either. The people moved further and further west until eventually they arrived in our California, and amidst our California to the Pueblo de la Reina de Los Angeles, the village, because a pueblo is a village, not a city, the village of Our Lady, the Queen of the Angels, which is the beginning of Los Angeles. And by the time of the end of the 19th century, and certainly the beginning of the 20th, I would say that the point of gravity of the spiritually interested groups moved to a very major extent to California, and in California to Los Angeles. Now then, let us look more, but sort of fishing around more or less in historical sequence as to who these were. Now I must admit that in terms of their beginnings, the biggest and most spectacular movement, which was mid-19th century in origin, did not start in the burnt-over district anymore, but in the Midwest, and that was spiritualism. And it's of spiritualism which was a gigantic movement, worldwide, but particularly swept over America like nobody's business. The spiritualist movements, which, became strong in the Midwest, but I'm sorry, also its origins were also in the state of New York, Hydesville, New York, some small place to which I have not been. where the two first mediums, the Fox sisters, Katie and Maggie Fox, began to become aware, so they said, of a spirit of someone who had once been in a body and died in the walls, in the basement of their house in Hydesville, New York, probably a farmhouse. But they managed, so they said, to communicate with that spirit. And out of that communication grew, as I say, a huge popular movement, which was represented in all over the United States and in many, many places of Europe, and was in America, was at home in the White House of Abraham Lincoln and his wife, as much as in the humblest hut out on the prairie or in the farmhouses of the Midwest or elsewhere. And it always had to do with the alleged and apparently at times certainly plausible communications with the spirit of the dead. Now, I have studied some of the spiritualist tradition in Europe, not because I believed in its salvific character, but for other reasons. Well, to be perfectly, why should I hedge about it? I was originally a seminarian and a schoolboy attached to the Cistercian order in Hungary and then also in Austria. And in Austria, I became attached to a very learned and very wonderful gentleman, the late Abbot Aloysius Wiesinger, Abbot of the Cistercian Abbey of Schlierbach, who was writing a book which I understand is still obtainable, called Occult Phenomena in the Light of Theology. Now, in order to get sufficient research material to that book, well, since I showed up and visited there, he said, come on, we have nothing but room in this huge abbey. Why don't you stay here for a while and help me with that book? Well, I said, Abbas Illustrissimus, illustrious Abbot, surely I'll be very happy to do so. And so even when I was in America, I carried on a correspondence with him. And in that context, we studied spiritualism, various others. It was a very, how should I put it, forward-looking gentleman theologically. For instance, one of his very frequent statements, which he also put into the book, he said, I am always unhappy when the Catholic writers attribute the spiritualist phenomena to the devil. He said, the devil and his cohorts have a lot more important things to do, he says, than to come and utter platitudinous statements through the mouth of some housefrau in a village. He says, come on. He was a very sensible gentleman. So I knew a little bit about the spiritualists and so at that time. Well, let me tell you very quickly of at least of one of the spiritualists in Los Angeles. Well, not immediately, because I wasn't really that eager to do that, but anyway, I found my way to the Agasha temple on Western Avenue, as I say, a huge barn-like place, like an auditorium, really, but not auditorium-shaped. And you could kind of go in most any time when the doors were open. And so we went in and we sat down and sort of scattered in a very loose fashion probably observing a spiritual version of social distancing, sat very somnolent people of both sexes. And we went down. So eventually a sort of busybody gentleman came up and wanted to, have you been here before? No, sir, we haven't. So let me explain to you. He said, you know, there are many Indian spirits here. I said, oh, Indian spirits? Well, yes, spirits of Indian braves. Oh yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. And you know, they come around when people sit down, and they come and they put the people to sleep. I said, oh, well, that's remarkable. Let me watch out for them, you know. So, needless to say, for myself and my companion, we were shunned, I think, by the Indian braves. They didn't come to us. I sort of visualized in a comical way of what might be going on. Indians with the big feathers on their head, whatever you call it, and so forth, and carrying a spirit tomahawk come into the room, and then they hit the people on the head and they go to sleep, you know. Whatever the case was, I think it was much more likely that things were so boring that people went to sleep. Well, we waited and waited, and we didn't even have the grace of sleep. So eventually, there was a big stage with a heavy curtain, rather larger than this one. So the curtain was parted, and behind the curtain, in a curious kind of contraption, like a human birdhouse, a sort of a wooden thing with a big door on it, sat Mr. Richard Zeno, the great medium. And he also seemed to be asleep. But with him it was known as a trance. With us it was just the Indian-induced sleep. And so after a while Mr. Zeno began to say various things. And his voice would change a little bit. Let me say it was not a very impressive performance, or at least not at that particular time. So after what I felt wasting for a couple of hours, we quietly snuck out, probably accompanied by a number of Indian spirits subsequently. Yet, you know, even though he was quite aged, and I think the whole situation was probably in a state of decline, but he was quite famous, but unfortunately I think at an earlier time. And in fact I can't think of his name, a well-known writer of the Los Angeles Times. I remember his wife. His wife's name was Brenda Crenshaw, who was herself a well-known psychic. But this writer, who incidentally came to my lectures at Philosophical Research Society very often, he wrote a book about Richard Zeno, the medium, and the book was entitled Telephone Between Worlds. Well, I have a feeling that the ringer on the telephone wasn't working all that well anymore by the time I went there. But now very, very quickly, because I think that you're going to get tired of this if you are not already, it's important to remember some things about spiritualism. Spiritualism was the most popular, you might say almost vulgar, if that is, vulgus in Latin means very common people. So the very common outgrowth of a development that became immensely important in our culture, much more important than you would imagine. And that was something that was started right around the turn of the 18th to the 19th century and came to be called Mesmerism. An Austrian doctor, you know, these Austrian doctors, whether they are called Sigmund or whether they are called anything else, Franz Anton Mesmer had developed certain techniques which were able to induce altered states of consciousness in people. They would go into lighter and deeper altered states of consciousness, and at times in these altered states they would undergo interesting changes. Since Franz Anton Mesmer was a medical doctor himself, rather like his later disciple Gustav Hahnemann, who became the founder of homeopathy, so even that switches back there. But let's say he managed apparently under certain circumstances by inducing these altered states of consciousness in people to have them undergo certain healings of their physical bodies. I am of the opinion, in retrospect, of course, very long retrospect, that probably many of these ailments were what back in the late 19th century, end of the 19th century, and in the 20th century came to be called hysterical ailments. Namely, people would become blind without any physical cause. People would become deaf without any physical cause. People would experience a paralysis of some limb. And they were not physiologically caused, but somehow caused in the mind. And therefore, if some change could be brought about in the mind, the physical symptoms would disappear. That's the kind of thing retrospectively, although there are many details of this, that Mesmer practiced. He wanted scientific recognition for his work. He went to France and appeared before the Académie Française, which is the place of the immortals, where all the very wise people of France and sometimes of other countries reside. And one of the people who sat at the Academy passing judgment on Mesmer was an American gentleman by the name of Benjamin Franklin. But let's say that the Académie Française and various French sages could not agree on the utility of Dr. Mesmer's work, and they condemned him. But out of what he started, an immense family of disciplines grew, some of a quasi-religious nature and some of a scientific nature, everything from spiritualism and Christian Science down to the psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud. All of these are related to the impulse given to Western culture by Mesmer. But certainly, and I have a little sort of a family tree of the Mesmerian tradition, a little diagram that I do. Some of you have probably received it in some of my lectures earlier, that shows you all these things that came from that, let's say, that root. Now, you may say, all right, that's very interesting, what else is new? But let's put it this way. Beginning with Mesmer and continuing through this spider web of teachers and of movements, a mysterious circumstance came to the attention of our culture, which the circumstance having been here all along, but it never having been intellectually or scientifically studied, namely that the mind, subsequently what after Sigmund Freud came to be called the psyche, is creative. It can make all kinds of changes. But in order to make such changes, it has to switch gears, so to say. It has to move into a different mode, at least temporarily, of functioning. And if that happens, all kinds of amazing things can occur. That is why the medical or semi-medical discipline of hypnotism was also derived from this discipline. And it's, but other people within the field have turned it into an instrumentality whereby to explore the otherwise not available, not visible, and not tangible forces of nature and of being. And among these, certainly we can find the spiritualists, where the mythos was primarily and almost exclusively that certain people, when they went into trances, when they underwent certain changes of consciousness, could communicate with the dead, or rather that the dead could communicate with the living through them. But of course, there were other people who pursued that line of thinking in a more profound way. And they came to advocate and to practice that, again, primarily by way of inducing certain states of consciousness which are other from the ordinary waking state of consciousness, one could discover hidden and mysterious data. Perhaps not the buried treasure of Joseph Smith, but data in the vast field within which much treasure lies, known as our psyche, our soul. And thus were born a whole number of disciplines, a whole number of quasi-religious associations. I dare say, although I would be criticized for saying this probably by my theosophical friends, including Theosophy, which occurred in, which came forward. This is important to remember. Came to the fore on American soil by way of two American citizens, namely in New York City in November of 1875, by way of a Connecticut Yankee of some national distinction, a friend and associate of President Lincoln, named Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, from Hartford, Connecticut. If you go to Hartford and are guided by the right people, they will show you a street, even today, named after the Occult family, old Connecticut family from which he came, and a Russian-born but naturalized American citizen, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Both of these people have pictures hung up there if you want to see it. So in New York, again, still in the original magic country, there was founded the organization, and indeed brought forth the vehicle of the teachings of what at its own level really became again a very, very important cultural influence, starting with the middle of the 19th century, going through the 20th and now into the 21st, and also spawning innumerable children of other groups, essentially studying the same subjects and so forth. So even though perhaps some of my theosophical friends wouldn't like me to express it in that fashion, even Theosophy has started by way of the induction mechanism of Franz Anton Mesmer. Now, I feel that I am doing too much history and things of this sort here, and let me make a concluding statement of a perhaps more theoretical nature. Now, I hold, and I could prove it with fairly academic data of proof, that the overwhelming majority of the heterodox religions and spiritual movements, whatever we want to call it, beginning with the early 19th century, all over the world, were centered within one particular set of data. And what is that? That when the mind is properly induced into another condition than it ordinarily enjoys, it can do all kinds of things. It can either actually do or pretend to be talking with the dead, and we can't put spiritualism down where there's a lot of fakery in it. It has also a lot of very interesting phenomena there. From that to many, many other phenomena, including healing, including delving into the depths of the mind and discovering great insights there, and ultimately also as the change in the mind, in the psyche goes deeper and deeper in making contact with realities, with realms, and with beings that ordinarily we don't have the faintest notion are there. And of course, you might say, well, that's not new. Look at in the mythology of the ancients, look at the history of the saints. Certainly it was there. But it was, let's say, what these phenomena were attributed to was different from what it came to be attributed now. For one thing, most of the phenomena, occult phenomena, miraculous events, whatever you want to call them, that occurred in the ancient world, Greco-Roman, Egyptian, and so forth, and subsequently in the Christian religion, were integrated in terms of in terms of how to be understood, how to be interpreted into the existing cosmology and the religious milieu of the time. The ancients had their gods and their goddesses, and also some lesser spirits. You know, people people think that let's say that the Roman gods and all that all of that mythology just started with Rome. But you know that Italy was a magical country long before the Romans got there. The Romans were probably a kind of renegade Greeks who left Greece and ended up with their ships eventually in Italy. And of course that's what a lot of the Roman poetry is all about and so forth, that integrated into the mythology. The Etruscans who lived in Italy were people of witches and sorcerers of the first order. And you can still find their caves where the Etruscan sorcerers sat in the various mountains of Italy. Then sometimes eventually Christian monasteries were built on top of them, but they're weird. They are very unusual. We stayed in a place a few miles outside of Rome, which had all the, you might say, the various levels of its own spiritual history. In the basement, so to say, the basement was a cavern, and through it ran a body of water. Excuse me. See, the Etruscans don't want me to talk about this, in all likelihood. And it was a grotto of the nymphs, established there thousands of years ago by Etruscans, the water spirits. There was still a little bit of that around. If you looked around, you could get a little impression of them. Then there was a nice building built over that, and there it became a small Benedictine monastery later on. But prior to that, it was also a temple, and the temple of divination to the Roman gods. So here was the Etruscans, the Roman gods, the Christians, and then at a certain time it was sold into private hands, but it still has a beautiful chapel in it which we used, and it sort of indicated the layers of spiritual influence one after the other, but they all have contact with something else. They all have contact with something outside of this physical world. And that contact in turn depends on the induction of an unusual state of consciousness within the individual. And so with the coming, we might say, in the wake of the French Revolution, and Mesmer lived and became famous right before the French Revolution. So when these great social changes were going on in Europe, a spiritual change was also dawning. And so after that, for a couple of centuries or so, the development went on, and always eventually it came back to one cardinal set of data. And what is that? That inside of us humans, as miserable as we might be, as prone to all kinds of afflictions, physical and psychological we might be, as greedy and stupid and and angry and wrong-headed as we can get, inside of us there is the key to an other reality. And when that key advertently or inadvertently is turned, we then commune with realities of the existence of which prior to that time we had very little, if any, intimation. In other words, here is a very, very important, well, I might call it fact. It's not a physical fact. A very, very important fact that we are the external extension, the small external intention of a reality of a world that is immense and that contains all sorts of important and insight-producing and at times also difficult and frightening conditions and beings. And that if and when we gain access to that inner world, we are then on the way to much, much greater and ultimately much, much more beautiful, much more helpful, much more healing, much more insight-producing realities than we have encountered before. Now, this is an immensely important set of facts. And the development of esoterica, of the esoteric and of the esoteric tradition, which always addressed itself to this and always tried to call attention to it in various ways, and which existed, believe you me, within the Christian church also. The Christian church, in many, many ways, was much more, throughout its long history, was much more inclusive than people imagine. Oh yes, there was the Inquisition, and let's say pretty rough institution, but and various other repressive measures, often against representatives of the esoteric tradition, but they always occurred when the ecclesiastical authorities became alarmed that these strange people in their midst are going to jeopardize the influence and the importance and the power of the church or of the churches. Otherwise, in certain periods of the Middle Ages, there was nothing unusual for village priest to say Mass in the morning with all of his parishioners there, and then wait till afternoon or evening, and then get those people who were interested in that into a secluded place and draw a great big circle and do some ceremonial magic and invoke various spirits. Said, well, you know, I have holy water and I have protection, nothing's going to happen to me, nothing is going to happen to you guys either. So let's say the openings into these other worlds were always there, and they were used by various people. Now, it is very important, however, to remember that with the coming of the secular age, which really started with the French Revolution, there also came, by way of Mesmer and of Mesmer's spiritual offspring, there came the gradual recognition that things can be done with us. That is why the Theosophical Society, for instance, after Blavatsky's death and so forth, having become very closely established in India, and then various Indian teachers in the later 19th century having come here, Swami Vivekananda and others. What do you think the various yogic and meditation techniques of India are? Well, they are the equivalent of Mesmer's discovery that one can turn little keys in the mind, and then the mind becomes profound. The mind becomes a road into deeper realities, and they are truly real, they are informative, they are insight-producing, and if approached in the proper manner, they can take the individual to important and good and valuable places. Now, an entire tradition coming from Neoplatonic and Gnostic and Hermetic sources, of course, existed in an underground fashion in Western culture that knew this and that had its own techniques of various kinds of very magic and theurgy, and indeed prayer and sacrament within a Christian context, cultivating that very thing. But let's say the discovery of this reality on a level of wide application did not come about until the 19th century, and then went through the 20th, and now here is in the 21st. And so I was feeling my way as to how to convey this, and I'll conclude on that note and this opening of our discussions on this. It is of crucial importance at this particular time in history, this particular time in the history of Western culture, to become aware of this increasingly and to truly recognize the reality and the immense creative importance of these discoveries. Because we are on our way to a very materialistic, a very secular, a very non-religious or anti-religious and unspiritual culture. And such a culture will not endure. Alan Watts, whom I consider to be a very perceptive and very wise man, said to us once, every culture worth anything, and that amounted to anything in the history of the world, was imbued and transfused and motivated, I'm now putting a few words into Alan's mouth, by religion. He says, no, it doesn't have to be this religion, it doesn't have to be that religion. But avenues of, first of all, the recognition of the existence and the road to transcendence is not just a luxury. It is the mode of survival of an individual and of a people and of a culture. And when that by various means is allowed to vanish from the culture rots like an apple that fell off the tree. So if we think that we live in a country, in a city, in a culture that has some merit, and it does. Anybody who denies it denies reality. If we think that we indeed live in something like that, then the road, the way, the opening to that inner reality must be utilized, must be trod upon, and must be valued. And once it is not valued, the culture will perish. Look at the attempts in modern times to create totally secular societies, such as the Soviet Union and others. Look where they are. Look where they are. Why? Because where the spirit is not present, the people will perish, one way or the other. And so, when we come to the New Alexandria, there must be a reason, and I'll be able to show you a closer experience of some of the things that went on here, just in this very canyon, and the people who have lived here, and the way that they related to the deeper realities. The pictures of some of them hang here on the wall, but to introduce them, whenever the spiritual realities were recognized and practiced, then things went much, much better. So if we want to see an improvement in our country, in our culture, even in our politics with what we have just lived through and so forth, we must recognize the rootedness of the human in transcendence. When that gear is turned, when that key is opened, that Mesmer opened in a secular way, but that was always there in magic, in religion, in meditation, in sacrament, and so on and so forth. Whenever that is done, then we are moving in the right direction. Then individually and collectively, we are following the dictates of something very, very important, of something very, very beautiful, ultimately also something very supportive and very kindly. Because there is no doubt about it that in this inner world, when we get hold of it, we have friends there. We have influences there, we can call them beings that are interested in supporting us, in helping us, in enlightening us, and in guiding us. But unless somehow we can turn the key, unless we can come to them, nothing will happen. The farther our world, our culture moves away from transcendence, the more awful, the more miserable, the more tortuous it will become, and the good will have increasingly disappeared. We are the only ones who can help that situation. We are the only ones who can guard against that. And we must guard against it by looking for the other, by looking for transcendence, by looking for that world which in a secular fashion Mesmer has opened up, and the various great leaders of religions have opened up long ago, because this world, ladies and gentlemen, is not enough. Zoe Oldenburg, the great historical novelist and historian of the Middle Ages, wrote a lovely historical novel, which was entitled "The World is Not Enough." Good title. and I think it might become a title for us. The external world, the material world, even the rational world is not enough. There is another. It has been discovered and rediscovered throughout history. It has come even to the city of Los Angeles and has established itself. And in our ensuing discussions, we shall look at various approaches, various modalities within that we could find here in Los Angeles. I think we are in a good place. I think we are, as St. Paul the Apostle said of himself, I am a citizen of no mean city. And no mean city was Rome. It was a city that eventually killed him, but he was still proud of it. And so I think we can be proud of America, and within America we can be proud of the city of the angels. Maybe the angels will help us. Maybe we will come to them. Maybe together we will still accomplish something good and great and wonderful and kindly and loving, and so mote it be. Thank you very much.